The scariest one even happened after that. On the third tip and trade, she said her source of information, which was another source, wanted $15,000. And this source was in California. She lived near the woman who had called me. And could I bring that to her in California? So my friend got the cash together, gave it to me. And I'm walking through LaGuardia Airport. I pull up in the cab at the airport and I have it in the bank envelope in my laptop bag, and I'm trying to figure out, am I going to put this bag on the x-ray machine? I'm probably not going to do that. I went to the restroom, stuffed it all in my shirt and my waistband and my socks, and I'm walking through TSA. Now at the time, it was just metal detectors. It's not like the full body scans we have today. And the agent said, anything in your pockets, sir? And there was actually nothing in my pockets. It was all in my shirt, my waistband, and my socks. And I walked through, went to the restroom, took the cash back out, put it in my bag. And when my flight was called to board to San Francisco, there was TSA agents at the gate, and they were stopping passengers randomly and checking their bags. And I was actually stopped by one of the agents, and she took my laptop bag. She saw the envelope of cash, and she turned to the other person and looked at me and said, "Sir."
Welcome to the show. I'm Jay Scherr, host of Business Minds Coffee Chat, where you get a captivating look inside the minds of game changers, risk takers, and visionaries who turn ideas into breakthroughs that shake up the world. Our mission is to give you fresh ways to think that spark growth in your business and life so you can make a mark that lasts. Robert Louis Stevenson is attributed to the quote, "Sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences." Well, on today's episode, we're going to talk about how good people make bad decisions, the psychological toll of becoming one of the FBI's most prolific informants, rebuilding trust after failure, and more. My guest is a husband to Sue and a proud father of 2 daughters. He's a former hedge fund analyst whose life took a dramatic turn when he crossed lines he never thought he would. Well, that path ultimately led him to secretly wearing a wire for the FBI in what became the largest insider trading sting of a generation. Today, he's a global keynote speaker, corporate trainer, and board advisor on behavioral ethics, compliance, and culture risk. He's also a graduate of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Please welcome Tom Hardin. Tom, it is so great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Jay. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. As am I. And I do want to share with you that reading your new book and just doing my due diligence has really been, it's been so insightful. And your story really is one of transformation. And I want to talk a lot about that on today's episode. Obviously, we're going to talk about your story and what ended up happening, but I think there's so many different parts to your story that sometimes don't get shared. And fortunately, you do such a great job sharing it in the book, but I'm really excited to unpack that a bit more today. So let's jump right in. I thought a good starting point for us would be for you to share maybe 2 or 3 words that you would use to describe yourself.
Authentic, vulnerable, and well, there's a longer phrase, I guess, still trying to improve.
Okay. Okay. Very good. So those 3 words, as I think about that, would you have used those 3 words to describe you, let's say, in your youth, like maybe in school and before you went to college?
I think always trying to improve, or really back then, it was always trying to achieve.
Mm,
certain goals.
okay.
Um, and authentic and vulnerable, I think that's a life lesson that I had to learn kind of the hard way.
Yeah, I can understand that. I would tell you that even today, up until probably 7 years ago, the the vulnerability piece was a difficult one for me. I'm in a much better place today when it comes to that, but life experience and the lessons that we have through life, I think open us up to new learnings, and that's been a big one for me. One I'm still working on, but I think I'm getting a little bit better. So, I'd love it if we could wind the clock back a bit in your story. Could you share a bit about your upbringing and talk a bit about your parents and what life was like early in life for you? And maybe as you're doing that, if you could maybe share with us what life goals you had for yourself way early in life. Did you have an idea what you wanted to do? This was pre-college.
Right. Pre-college, I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. So we're going back to the 1980s and 1990s. Middle class, middle of the middle class family. My father worked his entire career at the Coca-Cola company back when people stayed at just one company for their whole career. My mother ran a childcare business out of our home. And so we had 8 to 10 kids all over the house growing up. But they were really, I would just say they were really hard workers. We never lacked for anything, but we certainly didn't have, a lot of money. And so it was sort of always, we're on a budget, we're trying to make it work, but really just their work ethic was inspiring to me. And I think it just sort of pushed me to always want to succeed and to make them proud.
Yeah.
And that really went through my life. I remember I shared in the book, one of the first mountains I wanted to climb was reading all the World Book Encyclopedia from 1985. So I was a kid. My dad got those old encyclopedias for us, and I remember thinking at first, "Oh, this is 75 pounds of homework if we remember those encyclopedias." But the
Oh
next
yeah.
2 years, I read those, and then was a good student in a big public school and applied to. You mentioned Wharton in the bio, applied to a Reach school back in the 1990s. So back then we only applied to three schools, not the Common App today. And so I wanted to just achieve as high as I could go and keep reaching. And really, I think also I was interested in the outcomes and trying to engineer those outcomes as best as I could. So I was deferred in my application to an Ivy League school, and I became a one-man pitching machine, one-man campaign, sending my first emails ever to the admissions committee, trying to engineer this outcome with anything I could do at that time. So I was very focused on achievement. And once I got to the next goal, what's the next step? How do I keep going up?
So let me ask you something real quick on the focused on the outcomes and getting into Wharton and what you were able to do to finally receive admission. Was that something that you had just decided to do on your own? Had you had conversations with anyone who said, "Hey, I've done this. This worked for me. This might be something you might want to try"? Were your parents influencing that? Where did that come from?
I was trying to figure that out as well as I wrote the book. I interviewed, my parents obviously for the book, and really my dad told me as we were talking about this that it was all, as far as he could see and as far as I can remember, it was all very intrinsically motivated.
Wow.
Just I want to make them proud. My guidance counselor said, "Oh, that college you want to apply to, it's only an MBA school, not an undergrad." And my dad and I went to the public library and figured out that there was also an undergraduate program there. And so I think he was a big part of supporting me in terms of the goals I had and helping me reach that. So I think he really played a big part in terms of like he wanted his children to do better than him, and he was willing to really try to make that happen for all of us,
Yeah.
myself and my two brothers.
That's amazing. So you get into Wharton, and had you already before you went through the application process, had you already had an idea in your mind what your career path was going to look like and where you saw yourself in 5 years, 10 years? Had you had that type of clarity or that type of vision?
I really didn't. And business was almost by process of elimination. I
Hmm,
wasn't really in the arts or that part of my brain. Writing wasn't really my interest or my strength. And I knew I was good in math. And so I was just trying to figure out what could I do with that and landed on business and then thought, okay, what's the top business school? But it was really about just getting in and figuring it out there. I remember in high school, my friends, it seemed like successful parents were tax lawyers. I had a friend whose father was a tax lawyer, or CPA was a big profession. So I thought maybe that, maybe accounting. And then when I got to the university, I really focused on more on finance.
hmm.
This is where Warren Buffett attended, Donald Trump, Michael Milken. These were some of the people that attended this college, and I became more focused on kind of finance and trying to get that first job in investment banking. So I didn't know that when I was 18, but it sort of became my evolution through college.
Sure. So tell me, I just want to go back to mom and dad for just a moment. So you had some great examples around you. What was, if you think back on one of the most valuable lessons that you learned from your father, either something that he shared with you or maybe something that you just, through watching him, through watching how he navigates through life, what was one of the most valuable lessons you took away from dad? And then the same question in regards to your mom.
With my dad, I think it was just keep showing up. As I mentioned, he worked at Coca-Cola his whole career. It had its ups and downs. There were layoffs. There were years where he thought, he was going to be laid off as part of the restructurings, and that came and went. But he said, "Hey, what can I do? There's only things I can focus on that I can control,
Yeah.
and I can't really worry about things I can't control." And for me, that actually played a huge part later in my life as I was going through my FBI saga that we'll discuss. So that was one thing from my dad: just focus on what you can control. Um, and with my mother, she dropped out of college and she was just trying to figure out how to make a buck. And she just figured out, okay, I'll start a daycare business and have 8 to 10 kids at the house, and that'll help us with the family budget, with being able to pay the bills. And she was always sort of hustling and trying to figure out. She had this daycare business, she had other small businesses, and so that was really interesting to me to see her sort of have that drive, sort of have an entrepreneurial spirit. And my paternal grandmother was the same way, actually. She taught herself the stock market, bought a franchise of a cosmetic company,
Wow.
and was really just interested in entrepreneurship as well.
Amazing. So that's an interesting segue because you had both the kind of the exposure to the corporate world, right, with dad on the Coca-Cola side and then mom on the entrepreneurial side, your paternal grandmother. So kind of a confluence of influences from a business perspective coming your way, which really, you may not think about it at the time, but that really does open your eyes to what opportunities can look like down the road. So thank you for sharing that. So let's go ahead and move the timeline forward just a bit. So you're in Wharton now, and kind of walk us through landing the first career job, if you will, and what that experience was like for you.
Sure. So at that time, investment banking analyst programs were the big job to have. So if people aren't familiar, these are the big names: Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. At that time, for me, I applied to a bank called Donaldson, Lufkin and Ginrett in their Los Angeles office, and I became a summer analyst for them, a summer intern before my senior year of college, and was given a full-time offer. So I start in investment banking in 1999, and we're sort of nearing the top of the dot-com bubble, and we're doing all these IPOs for companies that are probably no longer around.
Right.
And it was just a lot of work. It was 100-hour work weeks, a lot of processing for clients. But I knew that this was where I wanted to start my career because you learn so much if you work, 2 or 3 years of 90 to 100-hour work weeks. That's about 10 years of experience in 2 or 3 years. And so I knew that's the direction I wanted to go. And I had planned on doing it for the 2 or 3 years until I was recruited by a hedge fund in early 2000. So only a few months into my first job as an investment banking analyst.
So at this time, so when you joined this first company in 1999, were you surrounded by highly successful people who were kind of opening your eyes to what that kind of life could be?
I was. So this was an office that was run by people who had worked for another bank called Drexel Burnham Lambert, where, if people aren't familiar, one of the most famous insider trading investigations before the one I was involved with involved Michael Milken, Ivan Boesky, and Milken had started the Los Angeles office of Drexel. And so the people that, when he went to prison, the people that had worked with him started this office for DLJ. And so these were people that had all the relationships of all the Fortune 500 companies. Ken Mullis ran this office. He now has his own bank, Mullis and Company. And I tell a story in the book. I remember one day hearing Ken's assistant say, "Ken, Netanyahu on line one, Donald Trump on line two." So imagine that just being your regular Tuesday. These were people that had a lot of exposure to big clients, and I was excited to be involved with that.
Sure. So, as you're going through this, you're excited, you're working a lot of hours, you're gaining a lot of experience, you're being exposed to a whole new way of life and a whole new way of living. I'm thinking that, and this is, I'd like to get some clarity from you. I'm thinking that your goals for yourself are probably shifting as well because you're starting to see something that you've not been exposed to before, seeing a new life for yourself. And I could only imagine that if you're hungry, that is very appealing.
It was, and it's sort of way different from where I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta. First getting into college, where you're around the cream of the crop, and then getting into this investment bank where you just ratchet up the level of people around you in terms of their intellectual capabilities and their goals for their careers. People like me, and so this was a great place I thought to be. This is just high achievers, people, really strong work ethic, and it just felt like this is the place. Now I was here, kind of what's that next step? So I will say I was always, I think, a little bit, there was some insecurities too with me, like, am I making the right decision? How long should I stay here? And then what's the next opportunity beyond the investment bank? And mind you, I'd just only been there a few months and
Yeah.
was recruited by a friend at a hedge fund. And then the way she described it, and me meeting that uh, the 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 individual who ran this hedge fund, when he was 32, I was 22. He interviewed me and said, "Hey, he had made $75 million the previous year." And I don't think I was so driven by money at the time. It was more about the status that he had at 32 years old. That's not a number I've ever heard before
Yeah.
that I even thought was possible. So I became a little bit more focused on that, a little bit more about what the financial outcome could be, or what that future could mean for me in terms of opportunity, if that was available to me potentially. So it was something I'd never even really considered before until I heard him talk about that, and he was only 10 years older than me.
Let me ask you something about status for a moment, because that's an interesting one that certainly can be a driver. But you said, if I heard you correctly, on one hand, it wasn't about the money necessarily; it was more about the status. And here you have an individual who's 10 years older, and that they're achieving great things, right? And when you think about status, was it Was it an intrinsic feeling? Was it having stuff, cars, houses? What was it that you identified in terms of status? When you think about that word at that stage in life, what came to mind for you?
Yeah, I definitely wasn't having things like toys. I wasn't really a collector of cars or anything like that. It was more about just the title and having that status in society. I remember when I got to college, I would read those lists every year of the highest earners in business, and it was always, hedge fund managers or private equity founders. And so that was a career that I knew could take me to the top of sort of society in terms of who society thinks about, of who are the top people. Now, it always shouldn't be about money, but I just felt, in my 20s that this is something I wanted because then if I had that status, there would be so many more opportunities for me. And so it became more about, I think, more about the title, the status seeking, and not so much, as I said, not so much about what I could do with the money if that were to come to me. Just like this was, again, me knowing I didn't have that, but that I was on the path potentially to have it. So there was a little bit of insecurity too
Yeah.
about not having it and how fast could I get there.
So, can we stay on insecurities for a moment? I'd
Sure.
love for you to share. Tell me a little bit more about the insecurities. And did the insecurities that you felt at that time, did they, at what point did those insecurities start to evaporate?
Yeah, and really, the insecurity story even started back in college. I said in the book, I'm Tom from Georgia. I put on a little bit of airs of being from Georgia. I brought skull tobacco for the first time and tried to dip. Not a great thing to do your first time in college, but I was trying to sort of put on this show of being this guy from Georgia, being an outsider, not belonging. And I think to some degree I carried that through with me into my early career. And I knew that there was other people that, had the private school, all the fancy vacations, all the great clothes, and I knew I wasn't part of that group. And I started to see that more and more as I got into my 20s in the hedge fund business, that these other hedge fund analysts, this was kind of like already a preordained career for them. This was already set up for them when they were back in high school. And so there was some of that kind of, I had to work hard for this. I had to get the top grades back in college. I had to get that investment banking job, and I had to fight to get this hedge fund job. And then a lot of these people I'm meeting are already, it seemed like it was already preordained. So I think I was judging them based on my own insecurities at that time,
Okay.
in my career.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So let's continue on the timeline here. And I tell you what, before we take a step forward, would you mind sharing with all of us, just to educate us on what a hedge fund analyst does?
Sure. So my job was to find stock ideas. So and I was covering tech stocks, and I was to present to my boss every week, these are the best stocks that we can buy. These stocks are the ones I think will go up the most. And in a hedge fund, you can also short stocks, so you can bet against stock prices. And so these are the stocks that I think are going to go down the most. And so in theory, if you own the stocks that are going to go up and are short the stocks that are going to go down, you should be able to make money whatever the stock market does. And for that, hedge funds are highly compensated. They keep 1 to 2% of the assets that they manage and 20% of the performance that they generate for investors. So it's very lucrative career, very lucrative business. But my job, basically every day, I'm calling companies, I'm traveling for tech stocks, I'm traveling to Silicon Valley and meeting with companies, and I'm trying to figure out, this exact thing I described, like what companies are the ones to own and which ones are the ones to bet against. And in technology, it plays itself out very well to long and short because there's always a new entrant with the new technology that you can own. And there's always the sort of dinosaur or the incumbent that you can be short. So that plays out through cycles even today now with what companies are using AI and which are not.
Yeah.
You can kind of see that playing out still through the markets.
Okay, so you're building relationships with these companies so you can learn as much about them as you possibly can. You're in front of them on a regular basis. Are you meeting with boards of directors? Are you meeting with the executive level of these organizations and asking questions, just digging into your research so you can better understand to be able to make good business decisions?
It's the executive level. So the chief financial officers is usually who I was meeting with,
Okay.
occasionally a CEO, and more often an investor relations representative who would, talk to analysts like me. And I figured out that if I met with them every quarter for a few years,
Hmm.
I could actually figure out when something had changed positively or negatively based on the answers they had given to me the previous quarter. So if something changed in their answer, I had then the insight to know, okay, this was actually something's changed and maybe we should, sell the stock if we owned it if it was negative, or buy the stock or short the stock just based on my repetition of these meetings with the same people.
Okay. So you were good at your job. Is that fair? I mean, is that fair to say
Yes.
at this point?
Yeah. Yeah. I was considered a good analyst. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So at what point do things start to change, or let's say the water gets a little muddy?
So later on in my, later 20s, and really through my 20s, I become aware that trading stocks on inside information is pretty rampantly happening at tech stock focused hedge funds. And what was happening is hedge funds would hire stock analysts like me from Silicon Valley companies so that they could call back to their old contacts at those companies and get really two pieces of information that was not public.
Okay.
They were getting information about upcoming company earnings announcements. And so if you know that, for example, Cisco Systems or Apple is going to report a certain earnings per share number next quarter, Wall Street also has their estimate. So if you actually had the actual information, you could be long or short the stock based on whether that was going to be good or bad versus Wall Street's estimates. And they were also getting information about takeovers. So company A buys company B. And so it got to the point where 60% of companies before they were acquired in mergers and acquisitions, the stock prices actually had spikes before the news came out. So these stocks were running up for weeks. So I would say bigger picture, this nefarious behavior almost seemed like it was normalized in the industry at that time. And I never felt I had to cross that line initially because I was a good analyst. I was good at my job. I was a moneymaker everywhere I went. But I also, again, came back to having these insecurities where there's this other group of people out there who have these relationships, have these connections inside these companies, and I'm not part of that group. So again, here's this group of people that I think probably even subconsciously I wanted to be a part of, and I described it as sort of being outside the clubhouse, I think, and looking in and trying to figure out the secret handshake. So I know what's going on. I'm still playing by the rules until my boss, after my last hedge fund I worked at, made our goals very short term. And so we lost money in the first quarter of trading for our investors.
Okay.
We were investing with a 3-year horizon. He comes into my office, closes the door, and says, "We just lost money in the first quarter. We have to start looking for shorter term opportunities to make money every month." So the goal just went from 3 years to monthly. And if the scoreboard resets every 30 days, the opportunity, the nudge to kind of go places that you shouldn't, certainly increases.
So in that conversation, the doors closed. That first of all, that had to come as an absolute shock that we're compressing time from 3 years to 30 days, right? Did you ask,
Yeah, I was
how
not
do we do
expecting that.
that?
I didn't. Yeah, so I didn't ask any clarifying questions. And if I could go
Okay.
back to talk to young Tom, there's many many things I would say, but really, hey, let's have the courage to speak up and ask ask some clarifying questions. Are we talking about anything goes because he was aware of this behavior in the industry,
Mm-hmm.
or are we going to stay within the ethical and legal guardrails? So I think it's really important for anybody, if you're in a situation where the boss comes in with something kind of ambiguous or a goal changes, you have to have the courage to ask some clarifying questions to make sure that you're safe. And I didn't.
So I just want to touch on that for a moment because that's a big point, and I want to make sure that everyone that's watching and listening right now heard that, because this is applicable in our careers, it's applicable in our personal lives, our professional lives. Clarifying questions, right? So if you could go back in time and have a redo, what kind of questions, and I'm sure there's lots, but give me maybe 3 questions that you would have asked. And then if you can think back to that moment, why did you choose not to ask questions? Or did you just not know the questions to ask? So give us a little bit of clarity there as well.
So as I think back, I would have clarified first of all, so what exactly happened in this phone call? Because he had just been talking to one of our investors who I guess was upset with our performance in the first quarter. So if I had sat him down and said, let's just talk through what happened on this phone call, I mean, we're telling all of our investors we invest with a 3-year horizon, and now we're changing it. Just to have a conversation like that with my boss, it wouldn't have, I don't think it would have taken a lot of courage to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, okay, we have that conversation. Now, when we're trying to make money every month, are we going to, if I were to get information that these other funds have, are we going to trade that? Are we going to pass on that or not? I think I would have been able to snap him out of this. Like, of course, we're not going to do that. I think he would have said that, but I can't, unfortunately, I can't rewrite history. And so I started making assumptions that, okay, kind of anything goes. And if I were to get information and it were to help us out, uh, I might use it, I might not, but it was very ambiguous, very gray. And Jay, I actually just stayed silent. I just nodded my head and he left. He was upset. And, I didn't think to even have that conversation at that time.
Okay. All right. So were you at all having conversations with either uh, coworkers, other analysts that were actually taking advantage of or participating in insider trading, but just to were you bouncing ideas off of anyone else? I mean, I don't know if you felt
Right.
like you were totally alone at this moment, but how do you process that?
So yes, I talked to as an analyst, I talked to other analysts at other funds, and I talked to 2 people that I mentioned in the book. One woman had worked for a billionaire, Roger Rotnam. If people look him up, he's the most famous person to be charged later in these FBI cases. And I suspected that she was herself trading on inside information. She worked in Silicon Valley, but I never felt that was part of my world until um, another person in my network who worked at a prop trading firm had told me about an upcoming deal happening. Another trader at his firm had told him that a company, Odessa, was going to be acquired by private equity. And I didn't trade in that stock. It was sort of like this guy could be full of it. Rumors are a big thing. Rumors go around. Things like this go around all the time. And then the deal happened exactly like he said. And so he made a bunch of money. His firm made a bunch of money. And I thought, wow, this is actually the first time I'm seeing this in my face
Mhm.
happening. And I didn't trade on the first one, but it started to become a little bit more normalized. Like, okay, this is how these people are making money. They're making these trades. Uh, what would happen if I were ever to receive this information again, something like this?
So, at any time during this whole process, did you think about mom and dad and your grandmother? Did any of that ever enter your mind? Like, if I did this and something went south, how would I feel about myself? And you know, you were obviously working really hard sh- to be proud in the eyes of your parents and your grandmother as well. Did those thoughts come to you at all?
Um, I hate to say it, but at that time, now I'm basically, 28, so 10 years out of the house. I think I became sort of more sensitized to the culture in my industry than the very good upbringing I had, do the right thing, focus on what you could control.
Yeah,
Um, I became so, I guess, subsumed by the culture at that time. Like, if you had told 18-year-old Tom, you're going to start making these decisions 10 years later, I'd say that would never be me because I'm a good guy, right? So
sure.
I think, at that time, those thoughts didn't really come into my head. I became really open to the possibility of what if I were to receive a tip? What would I do? Would I trade a little bit? Because seems like what everybody else is doing. So I never thought about, oh, this is like something I shouldn't be doing. It was more about like, this seems pretty normalized at this point.
So walk us through then the very first time that you took information, insider information, and actually used it to benefit the company that ultimately benefited you as well.
So a few months after the first tip that my friend had shared that I didn't trade on, the woman I mentioned, she was an analyst. She called me and said, "Hey, Tom, you'd made me a lot of money over the last few years on some great ideas." I was sort of gave her my ideas of the year, and she said she had something for me, and I couldn't tell anybody. And she said there was a public company that was going to be acquired in a few weeks. Here's the date, here's the price, here's the private equity firm. It was almost like that movie Wall Street. If people are familiar with sort of, Blue Horseshoe loves Endicott Steel, just to use a dated reference, but something very specific. And she was always full of rumors, but this sounds like exact information. And she said her source worked at Moody's, which is a bond rating agency.
Okay.
And so he was some kind of roommate with her cousin or something like that. And here's the information. And I didn't trade on it that day. I thought, wow, this is really like, when I speak at colleges the day I say, imagine the answers to the test just fell in your lap. And this is what exactly happened to me. So I didn't make any trades that day, but later that day, I was talking to my friend at the trading firm who had shared the first tip with me and said, "Hey, this is, we're catching up. He's down that month. We're talking." He said, "Are you hearing anything out there I could take a flyer on?" And we called it taking a flyer because those were small positions.
Okay.
I said, "You know what? I just got this information today about this company that's going to be acquired." So just pausing right there, by me sharing the information with him, I've now actually violated the law just by tipping inside information, and I haven't even traded yet, and I have no idea what he's going to do with it. Apparently, he tells his whole firm every day the stock is trading up a little bit, and I know he's going to make millions. The woman that just called me is going to make millions, and I'm watching the stock go up just a little bit every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was starting to get a little bit of FOMO, so the fear of missing out. Like, these guys, and I'm just going to sit here and watch this. And the guy that I called calls me back and says, "Hey, are you in? Did you buy some?" And at my firm, I could buy a stock in our portfolio and not have to talk to my boss, as long as it was less than 1% of the funds that we manage for clients, a starter position, like a new idea.
Okay.
And I remember calculating and buying like a 0.9% position in the portfolio in Kronos. And right there, just by putting that order in on the computer, I committed securities fraud that day.
Okay. So this is the first time. And what was the ultimate outcome of that particular trade? So what did the firm end up generating income wise, and what was your take on that?
So a few weeks later, so there were four trades like this where she would call. I'd make these small trades, and on the first trade, I don't recall, it was a couple $100,000 that the firm made. So my
Okay.
take personally, my share of the profits on the first trade, it may have been maybe nine or $10,000 on the first one. But Jay, I remember when it happened, I thought, oh my gosh, this is not a rumor. This is actually happening. I might get fired. My boss is going to see I did this. I go into my morning meeting with him
Mhm.
and he says something like, oh, it's one of those, keep me out of it. Don't tell me how you're doing this, but it is helping us out, meet that monthly performance. So he, there's this term, I think, for the military, like commander's intent, where his intent, he knew what I was doing, but he wasn't asking questions. And he was also being willfully blind. And I don't blame him. I made these decisions, but that sort of set the spark for if I were to get future tips and place small trades, he seems to be okay with it.
Interesting. And that also is part of a developed culture as well. So you saw your boss's reaction and wanting to, was on one hand was letting you know that, hey, you're helping out here, right? I don't know if he said good job, but
Right.
this is actually helping the business. And then on the other hand, I don't want to hear about it, right? I don't want to know what you're doing or how you're doing it, but
Yeah.
keep doing it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's
Okay.
exactly what the message was.
Okay.
Yeah.
So of the four total trades, your actual what you received in compensation from all four in aggregate was what?
$46,000.
$46,000.
So I never thought about, yeah, I never thought about the money.
Yeah.
It was all about, as we were discussing, the insecurities, not having the status. Now I had the status. Now I was in the in group. It was never about the money.
Yeah. So I want you to share also this part of the story because with some of these trades, the information that you received wasn't free. It came at a cost.
Right.
And talk to us about that, how that transpired, and how the money exchanged hands.
So after the first trade I described happened, the woman that had tipped me called me that day and said, I hope you loaded up. And I said, oh, I bought a little bit. And she said that the Moody's analyst who had tipped her was going to be in New York. And could I write him a check? I think it was 15, $10,000. And I thought, oh my God, that sounds illegal. Had some choice words for her. Like I would never do that. I had rationalized the trades. Of course, I've already did that, but I
Sure.
could never write this guy a check. And I called my friend and said, here's the situation. If this is going to continue, this guy wants the money. And so he said, no problem. He meets me at Grand Central Station in the basement, very clandestine, slides me an envelope of cash. And I remember walking out on 40th Street in Manhattan, and there was a guy on the corner who said, are you Tom? And I held the FedEx envelope out to him and didn't even make eye contact. It could have been anybody in New York getting to the cash, but I'm pretty sure
Wow.
it was him. And you asked earlier, Jay, about, what did I think about my parents and my grandmother? I thought about when I was walking back to the office, I thought about them right at that point, like how disgusted they would be with my this this is criminal behavior. This is way beyond just rationalizing a trade. I'm actually dropping off cash on the sidewalk. How disappointing it would be. And it's always a good frame for people if you're going to make a decision you're not sure about. Would you be happy if your grandmother read about that decision on the front page of the Wall Street Journal? Because I would have that experience, a few years later.
That's right. As a matter of fact, you mentioned Warren Buffett earlier in the conversation. I remember Warren Buffett saying that as well. When you think about your choices and decisions, is this something that you would want to see on the front page of the paper?
It's always a good test. Yes.
Absolutely. Okay, so that was one of the instances where money is
Yes.
exchanging hands. That's scary. So scary.
It was. And the scariest one even happened after that. On the third tip and trade, she said her source of information, which was another source, wanted $15,000. And This source was in California. She lived near the woman who had called me. And could I bring that to her in California? So the same thing happened where my friend got the cash together, gave it to me, and I'm walking through LaGuardia Airport. I pull up in the cab at the airport, and I have it in the bank envelope in my laptop bag, and I'm trying to figure out, am I going to put this bag on the X-ray machine? I'm probably not going to do that. How am I going to get this through? And so I stuffed it all. I went to the restroom, stuffed it all in my shirt and my waistband and my socks, and I'm walking through TSA. Now, at the time, it was just metal detectors. It's not like the full body scans we have today. So I remember walking into the TSA line, and the agent said, anything in your pockets, sir? And there was actually nothing in my pockets. It was all in my shirt, my waistband, and my socks. And I walked through, went to the restroom, took the cash back out, put it in my bag. And when my flight was called to board to San Francisco, there was TSA agents at the gate. This was maybe a few years after 9/11, so there was still very much a focus on security at the gates. And they were stopping passengers randomly and checking their bags. And I was actually stopped by one of the agents, and she took my laptop bag. She saw the envelope of cash, and she turned to the other person and looked at me and said, "Sir, have a nice flight." So I went
Oh,
on to the plane and boarded and thought, "Oh my God, I'm never doing this again."
oh, Tom. I can't even imagine how you were able to
Yeah.
have some sense of calm, where you don't look like, somebody who's sweating bullets and, whose heart's about to pop out of their chest. That's an amazing story. So tell us then, how does the FBI approach you?
So it was the fourth and final trade was in October,
Mhm.
and it was not until July. So, maybe 9 months after the fourth trade, it's July 8th, 2008. I'm leaving my apartment to drop off some dry cleaning in Manhattan before getting a taxi to work. I step on the sidewalk and I hear this voice on this Manhattan sidewalk. Are you Thomas Covey Hardin? And the last time I heard my full name was I was back home. My mother was going to whip my butt. So it wasn't mom on the sidewalk. It was two FBI agents, dark suits, wallets out, FBI, come sit down with us. So it was like any show that you'd see on TV. We sat down. There was a Wendy's right there next to the dry cleaner. We sat down. He said, "Hey, man, we know about your four trades last year. We know that you were just down in Georgia last weekend visiting your baby nephew, and they knew his name for his baptism." And so my head was spinning. And my first thought with the FBI in my face was, oh my God, my dad's going to kill me. What's he going to say? I'm still in my 20s, still close. And I thought, oh my God, my wife's going to find out. She has no idea about these trades. I never told her. And then I thought she's going to leave. We just got married. And then I thought, oh my God, this might impact my career. Oh my God, I might be going to prison.
Mm.
But it went from dad to prison. And I started making implicating statements. Yes, I made those four trades. In fact, there was these cash payoffs, and the FBI starts writing all this down. I don't really think they had any idea. I just started confessing to the FBI, and this went on for probably an hour at Wendy's. Me terrified, me sweating through my shirt,
Right.
sticking to those plastic booths, confessing to the FBI.
It's also interesting to me. I mean, this is a small detail, but you're in the middle of a public restaurant having this conversation, and I mean, I guess prying eyes and ears didn't matter to them.
It didn't matter when we sat down at the table. They did say, "Look around. Is there anybody you recognize here?"
Mm,
And we were upstairs at the Wendy's, so there was nobody even. There was maybe two other people there.
okay.
Didn't recognize them, and so then we had that conversation.
Okay. All right. So you're opening up, giving as much information as you knew as you could, probably more than they were expecting, but understandable at the same time. So what what happens next? How do they actually engage you to become an informant for them?
So they said, was I aware of insider trading happening in the industry? And of course, I looked at them like, yeah, it's rampant. And they said I had the opportunity to help them clean up the industry. And I didn't put Informant together at that point. I took his card and said, should I talk to a lawyer? And the FBI actually said, we'll let you know when you can do that. So they're not supposed to say that, but they're just trying to build cases. And I should have known I could talk to a lawyer. I didn't talk to a lawyer for almost 2 years. Took their card and then called them after a few days. Called them and said, "Hey, what is this about? Helping you?" I had lunch with them, and they said, they had a small piece of metal at lunch. And at the time, we still had Blackberries, and I was thinking, that looks like a Blackberry battery. And the agent said, this is a recording device. And I said, do you mean body wire? They said, yes, this is something you're going to have to wear to help us build cases against people in the industry. And usually an informant would have to wire on somebody that they knew well.
Mm-hmm.
And because the individual that I had tipped and the woman that had tipped me, I figured out had already worn a wire on me, I helped the FBI kind of build cases outside of my network and help them target who I felt were the worst actors at the time in the industry, people whose business models were insider trading. So I had to build relationships while I was wearing this body wire, this recording device.
Wow. Now, at this point, when the decision was obviously made to become an informant, had you shared anything with your wife, Sue, now?
Yeah, so the FBI approached me on Tuesday morning and they said I could only tell my wife about this. I could tell nobody else.
Okay.
And I quickly violated that. Later on, a few hours after I went to the office, I went over to St. Patrick's Cathedral for a confession. I had just converted to Catholicism for marriage with my wife and thought it'd be a great time for a confession, talk to the priest. And then I was having, I think, true panic attacks, just bad sweats. Wednesday, Thursday, I would get to the office before she woke up. I would get home after she went to bed. I didn't want to have to confront her. How would I even have this conversation? Is she going to leave? She had no idea about this. What's she going to think? And so Friday after work, I knew I couldn't get through the weekend with the secret. And so I got home, how was your week kind of conversation. And before this, she was actually working at Lehman Brothers. And of course, they were about to go under. And so she was having a heck of a time at work. And I said, let me go first and tell you about my week, what happened. And I told her everything Tuesday morning. I remember in as I wrote the book and interviewed her actually last year about this, she said she remembered that I wasn't sugarcoating it. I told her exactly what happened
Okay.
and that I accepted responsibility. And so she heard the whole story. She said, can you say that again? And I told her again. And the way she took it was, well, you didn't do anything to hurt me. And if they're giving you the chance to clean up the industry, you should probably do it. And I would learn later, Jay, that 85% of marriages, when a spouse brings a felony into the marriage ends. Most
Wow.
spouses are going to walk out the door right there. And so it seemed like it wasn't going to be easy, but she reacted, probably the best possible way that she could have reacted.
Well, that's a testament to her strength and resilience and character and love for you and belief in what the two of you are building together. And obviously giving good counsel as well, that if you've got an opportunity here to help clean up the industry, take it. You're owning your responsibility in this. Now you can turn it around and actually do something good. That's powerful. That's a big decision to make.
It is. Now, I still can't believe, even as I wrote the book, that she was able to get through all of this and be really almost like I mentioned earlier, sort of the stoic thing my dad told me, just focus on what you can control. That's almost what she instilled in me. There's so much that's going to be out of our control. Just focus on what I could control at that point, which wasn't a whole lot,
Yeah.
obviously, but that that came back.
So you end up providing valuable information to the FBI that does make a difference, that does begin to clean up or help clean up the industry. although to your point, obviously it was running rampant. And what was the ultimate outcome in terms of what you were doing for the FBI? Then I want to shift and I want to talk about your relationship with Sue, because I'm really curious, since you brought up that statistic of 85% of marriages don't survive a felony. That's a big number. I want to gain a little insight on the two of you and how your marriage was able to not only survive this, but thrive as a result, and where you are today. So let's start with kind of recapping the FBI piece, and then let's talk about the relationship.
So for 2 years, this is kind of the riveting part of the book. It's just sitting down, building relationships with people, getting them in these recorded conversations. And I didn't really think it was going anywhere. And about 2 years into it, I saw 20 people were on CNBC being arrested, the classic perp walks, handcuffs, and Tipper X was revealed that day as the key informant. And I had no idea I was Tipper X. The FBI said, "Yeah, you're Tipper X. You should talk to you should talk to a lawyer now." Spoke to an attorney, and what happened was it was 7 years of me waiting to be sentenced after my
Okay.
name came out, or 7 years after the FBI approached me on the street to being sentenced. And because I helped the FBI actually build 20 of the 81 cases, they arrested 81 people on Wall Street. I helped them build 20 of those cases. I was not sent to prison, and there was some risk to that because the Occupy Wall Street movement was pretty heavy at that time, and the judges were throwing the book at people in these cases. But the um, the FBI actually did me a favor in writing a very nice letter for me in terms of how much I helped them, and the judge saw that and said, "Just go on with your life." But I still had a felony conviction. I still had to deal with what was I going to do professionally? Would there ever be anything to do professionally ever again, or would I just be not just a stay-at-home dad, but would that be my thing I'm just doing and not employable? So that was really a struggle I wrote about in those years of dealing with just not as a man, as a husband, as a father, not being able to provide for the family was just very emasculating to me. And I felt, and it was my own doing. So nobody else did this to me. That was the hard part. But Sue was always just saying, "You got to send to this. You're going to get this out of it." So she just kept saying that the whole time through this, or some version of that.
Did the two of you, either together or individually, go through therapy, go through counseling?
We did not. I was just very clear with her. She was concerned for my safety with all this wire wearing stuff, as
I'll
any wife
bet.
would be, I think. So
Sure.
I would have these conversations like, "This is the task today is as the informant. Here's what I'm doing. Here's where I'm going."
Hmm.
And I was always just keeping her in the loop around that. Just I thought I'm just going to be extremely transparent about what's happening here, to keep her informed so that she's not concerned for my safety. And there's a crazy story where somebody invited me to a swimming pool to see if I was wearing a wire. That was the most intense situation. And then afterwards, I basically said, "Sue, I don't, I'm applying to jobs every week, but nobody's getting back. Most of my old Wall Street contacts want nothing to do with me." And she said, "Hey, just be the best again. Be the best stay-at-home dad you can be. Be a good, influence. Be a great father to our then two daughters at that time, and you'll figure it out." I mean, I was going to have to find work at some point. She was working for one of Lehman Brothers' clients, but it was really touch and go for years in terms of that client's liquidity and financial position and her job. But she was able to hold something down. And I just remember always having really clear conversations with her about what I was trying to do, jobs I was applying to. And she'd also snap me out of my pity parties I'd have sometimes. I was not really at first totally accountable for what I did.
Okay.
I would see, other cases years later. I wrote about there was a case where a major bank was charged with laundering money for El Chapo through their New York office, and all the bank had to do was pay a fine. And these employees went to work the next day like nothing happened. I remember showing that to Sue one morning and say, "Can you believe this? This bank just paid a fine, and I have a felony for $46,000." And she said, "Hey, is that helping you find a job?" So you talk about some tough love.
That'll stop
She
you in
gave
your
that to me, and I
tracks.
needed it at the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Sounds like she held a mirror up to you, and at times it's difficult to look in it.
All the time.
And yeah, I hear you. So how is the relationship today stronger than it's ever been?
It really is. I mean, we've been through the fire, and again, it was all me. And so I think when things come up now, our daughters are now teenagers, so we have the trials and tribulations of being parents, teenage daughters, but nothing really. It just seems like nothing phases us like it does maybe other families that haven't been through something like this, or we're able to deal with things in a really great way. Like we're on the same page with how we parent, and communication is great. And Sue never actually ever really talked about this experience until it was pretty surreal to be interviewing. Imagine sort of interviewing your wife for your memoir, which I did last year. And I said, "Hey, what was it like for you during this time? It's been a while." And she said, "Tom, thanks for asking," because I never did. At that time, I was just so focused on myself.
Sure.
And so she told me about it. And the one time she ever spoke, I was invited to speak on a cruise ship last year, and they asked for two talks. And so for the second talk, I interviewed Sue about her experience. She was up for it. And someone in the audience said, all the wives put their hands up and said, "Hey, how did you get through all the bad times?" And Sue, there was no prep for this. She said, "Hey, there was good times we've had. There was tough times that Tom talked about, but there was no bad times, because bad times is when you turn your backs on each other and you lost the trust. And we never had the bad times. And to read the story, to go through all this and have her to process it as those were not bad times, it's just unbelievable how she was able to do that."
Truly. Truly. Tell me about your two daughters, and because they're teenagers now, what what
Yeah.
kind of questions are they asking in regards to you and in regards to this situation?
So they were, yeah, it's interesting because I was a stay-at-home dad when they were really young.
Hmm.
And then the FBI invited me to speak about this experience, and that turned into the speaking career I have today. So when they were in elementary school, I was trying to have the conversation with them at their level, always through their years, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old. Dad did a bad thing in his career at some point, and now he's trying to help people not make those same decisions. But they were always curious. If you ever hear like you're 8 years old, oh, your parent did a bad thing. What did they do? And so one day in elementary school, my daughter Googled Tom Hardin jail. Like she just thought, oh, dad must have gone to jail. And then the principal saw on the Chromebook, I guess, that she was Googling that, called me and said, "Hey, you should probably have a deeper conversation at this point." So
Wow.
I had that. And now today, as teenagers, I mean, really, the first time they heard the full story was on that cruise ship.
Okay.
And my 16-year-old came up to me at that point and said, "Wow, I never knew the whole story." And from what she learned is that one decision can really impact your life. I said, "Hey, this is worth the price of the cruise." That one lesson was, taking something good out of something bad that I can, teach to them.
Yeah. So today, do you feel that redemption is still happening? Do you feel like you are redeemed today?
I think it's still an ongoing process. I'll never feel fully redeemed. And I think the hardest part that I go through is somebody that's in a situation like this. I remember talking to somebody who reached out to me a few years ago during the college admissions scandal, the parents and all that. One of the people in those cases reached out, and he said for him, he lost his job, everything. The hardest part was forgiving himself. And I think for me that resonates. Like you have to accept responsibility, which I did. You have to get help. You have to get outside your own head and reach out to people to help you get through this, the people that know you, who you are. And the hardest part is really self-forgiveness. And one big step forward I took with that was understanding guilt versus shame. Whereas for years I thought I'm a terrible person because I did a bad thing, and that's the shame.
Yeah.
And the shame doesn't help anybody. But the guilt is, yes, I did a bad thing, and my kind of penance for this is to go out and share this story and hopefully help prevent people from also making their own bad decisions. And I'm of two minds. Like I could not talk about this ever again, and that wouldn't help anyone. Or I can continue to share the story, and hopefully at some point it will help people in their own decision making and their own pressures and their own points in life, not just in the workforce, about how these bad decisions start and how you can push pause.
Yeah, I when I think about you and I think about what you've been through and the work that you're doing today, you're speaking on stages, you're speaking in front of companies, you're speaking about the things that your own story, but the lessons learned and the impact that you're making today is it really is incredible. And another thing to think about as you are speaking to these organizations and doing the good work that you're doing, the ripple effect from that, the way that you're impacting culture, the way that you're impacting those small decisions that become the big decisions really is remarkable to think about. And I know that you're taking everything that you've been through, every lesson that you've learned, every relationship that you've developed, and you're turning that into a positive. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat and sharing part of your story. Obviously, there's so much more to it, which is why we're going to put a link in the show notes to be able to pick up a copy of Wired on Wall Street. It is truly a compelling story, and we just scratched the surface today. So as we are wrapping up, I have one more question for you and then just one ask. So here's the question. If you had an opportunity today to sit on a park bench with any one person who is either still living or is no longer with us, and you could ask that person one question. First, share with us who that person would be. And then secondly, what is the one question that you would want to ask?
I'm just thinking, I would probably want, just going through our conversation here, I'd probably want to talk to 20 something Tom
Okay.
and ask, do you really think it's worth it?
Mm.
Yeah. If I could talk to my
Ooh,
younger self, that's the person I'd want to talk to.
okay. That's a really good response. Would you be surprised by the response, no matter what the response was?
I don't think I would be. I think it's so easy to try to rewrite history, or, think how things would have changed and played out different ways. But um, if I could give advice, it would just be, hey, don't be drowning in insecurity. Focus on yourself. Don't compare yourself to others. Just compete against yourself. If I could talk to 20 something Tom,
Yeah.
whether he would listen or not, I'm not sure.
Sure.
But
So that's a
that's what I
whole
would
different
say.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And then here is my ask. I would love it if you would give all of us, everyone who's watching and listening right now, and me, one challenge. What is something that you would challenge all of us to do starting immediately?
I would say this week, have a conversation with someone you trust about where your own ethical lines actually are, and not in the abstract. I would get specific. So like, what would you do if your boss asked you to shade the truth on a report? Or what if you found out a colleague was cutting corners, and staying quiet was easier than speaking up? Or what if the shortcut everyone else takes would make your quarter look better? I'd give anything to go back and have that conversation before I made the choices I made. So don't wait until you're already at the line to figure out where it was.
That's so good. Such a great challenge. Tom, again, thank you so much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. I truly appreciate you sharing of your story, being vulnerable, one of the words that you use to describe yourself, and just pulling the curtain back, I want you to know how grateful I am, and also thank you for sharing your story in Wired on Wall Street.
Oh, thank you, Jay. It was a pleasure to be here.
Very good. Thank you. And for all of you, I want to thank you so very much for watching and for listening. And I do have a super quick favor. Would you please take just a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts? That helps us expand our reach and attract amazing guests just like Tom Hardin. And to watch more episodes, all you need to do is visit jscherbusinessconsulting.com, click that podcast button. And until next time, my friends, keep learning, keep growing, keep working to reach your potential, and run out to buy a copy of Wired on Wall Street. And we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.